everyone. I hope you had something approximating a reading week, or not, as the case might be, but welcome back to IRES's weekly seminar series. We are really lucky today to have Andrew Barron with us, who is speaking to something that we're all sort of familiar with, but perhaps not at all schooled up on, as a language that's become common. But I want to first acknowledge that we are sitting on Vancouver's Point Grey campus, or some of us are, which is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'd also like to acknowledge that you're probably joining us today from all kinds of other places near and far, and so to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Jiaying has the pleasure of introducing Andrew today, so I'll turn the mic over to her. She's a colleague of his in psychology, but welcome, Andrew. Really looking forward to this.
Thanks, Gary. This is my great pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague, Andrew Barron, as our speaker today. Andy is an associate professor of psychology at UBC. He's also the founder and director of the Living Lab at Science World. He's also a member of the Engendering Success in the STEM Consortium that fosters greater engagement and interest in STEM among primary school-aged girls. Andy's research examines the human capacity to be prejudiced. This work focuses on identifying the cognitive foundations of intergroup bias from infancy to adolescence, with a particular emphasis on developing optimal strategies for reducing implicit bias. Now, this is his official bio, and now I'm going to turn into something more unofficial from his own words. Andy was born in Boston in 1979, but he was unable to speak coherently for 9 months and didn't learn to write until he was several years old. I think my first sentence came out when I was 18 months old. So I think we're both late starters there. Andy managed to get into preschool and eventually transitioned to grade school, where he passed through the grades with a little run-in with the school principal by staying on the straight and narrow, or at least avoiding getting caught. And he also managed to get his MA and PhD in psychology from Harvard. On the non-academic side, he consults with global companies interested in shaping the implicit associations that consumers have with their brands and products. So without further ado, let's welcome Andy Barron.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna share my screen now. All right, so you should hopefully all see my screen now. I'm really excited to be here, so I appreciate that opportunity. And thank you for that kind introduction, Jiaying. So obviously this talk is going to be really focused on looking at this question of, are we born racist? But I imagine a lot of you have questions about implicit bias more generally, either for other social groups or even in non-social domains. And I'm more than happy in the Q&A to field any questions that you have just about how implicit bias forms at any age, and how can we change it at any age. And so if you have any of those kinds of general questions, definitely feel free to ask those during the Q&A. And so somehow miraculously in 30 minutes, I'm going to try to answer this question, are we born racist? And I like to begin simply because I think we can't help but be shocked by a lot of the events that led to mass protesting across the US and the world over last year. And I think we can really, while many of us recognize that racial discrimination exists on multiple levels, from individual minds to institutions to structural forms, and that racial bias really spans many generations. While many of us can recognize this, it's somewhat surprising that, as obvious it may seem to us, these basic ideas that some lives feel less valued than others has been met with protests as well around the world. And somehow this basic message that in this particular case about Black Lives Matter was really perverted by those who weren't willing to concede or even acknowledge that racism is real and disproportionately borne by people of color. Somehow it seems that this plea to acknowledge that there's racism and structural forms of it and that Black lives aren't being valued in the same way, somehow turned into this battle of us versus them. And in trying to make sense of it, I think we can look to the words of Kipling, who wrote, "All the people like us are we, and everyone else is they." And I think the spirit of this notion of that Kipling is really capturing is that we tend to divide up the world into an us and them kind of mentality. You're with us or you're against us. You're like me or you're not like me. And we do this for a lot of different social categories. And race is obviously one of them, and certainly we do this for gender. But we seem to just effortlessly want to divide up in the world into those like us and those not like us, right? We see this for just about any dimension that we can really think about, even ones like just whether or not you support wearing masks or believe in vaccinations. There seems to be an us versus them kind of mentality that grips our minds and shapes our feelings, shapes our behavior. We even do this with our political ideologies and our views on election integrity. There becomes this battle of us versus them. And given what seems to be this basic tendency to want to divide up the world in this fashion, when we see photos like this and other ones where you have young teenagers in an effort to ask someone out on a prom are clearly espousing very racist ideas, right? And this is not a lone example. That there's a wave of these kinds of prom proposals that really took over, at least in the US last year. We have to ask ourselves when we see things like this, especially when perpetrated by young children, this question of, are we born racist? And in today's talk, I'm going to try to answer this question as best I can with all of the data that we've got. To give you a little bit of the structure of what we'll try to accomplish, first, what we're going to generally look at, broadly speaking, we're going to look at the developmental trajectory from childhood to adulthood with respect to explicit and implicit bias, right? So explicit bias being the stuff that's consciously accessible, that you can verbally ask someone, how do you think about this person or that person? And they can answer you with their words. And then importantly, we're going to look at the developmental trajectory of implicit bias. We're next going to then look at the malleability of implicit bias across development with an eye towards trying to identify if there are developmentally opportune times, meaning a key time in development where we'll have the most success at trying to change implicit bias. And then from there, we're going to end by addressing the roots of implicit bias with some really exciting research conducted in infancy. So before we get into all the phenomena with implicit bias, I want to give you a snapshot of the historical research that's been done on explicit race bias, because there's been a wealth of research that's been done in that area, but there's an interesting paradox that really emerged in this literature. And that's what paved the way for researchers trying to understand the nature of implicit bias in its development. Here goes the paradox. When you look at explicit race bias, what we see developmentally is a decrease in negative attitudes towards the outgroup. So I'll explain this in a little bit more detail. Typically, what you see is that race bias on explicit measures emerge by ages 3 or 4, and this starts to peak around age 7, where people will profess the strongest race bias. But then throughout adolescence, you see this gradual decline. And by the time you get to young adulthood, on average, people are saying, I like everyone the same, and they're not expressing any explicit racial bias. This in and of itself isn't the paradox, but here comes the paradox. Over the same period where we see this decline in negative attitudes towards the outgroup, in other words, becoming more egalitarian, we see a developmental increase in negative behavior towards the outgroup. As children get older, we see fewer interracial interactions and friendships, and we see persistent evidence of discrimination in housing, employment, healthcare, and education. And the paradox is, how is it on the one hand, we could become more egalitarian in what we say and think, but our actions don't reflect that? researchers identified this as a problem, and they looked to our measures, the way we traditionally would study bias, to say there's some obvious limitations with how we would traditionally ask people about their racial bias. There's an assumption that we have mental access to all the thoughts and feelings that might affect us. And there's a notion of that people want to appear desirable to others. So you don't want to say something that's going to offend somebody else. And by virtue of this concern for social desirability, researchers were concerned that people might just say what they think you want to hear. When researchers started to look at developing implicit measures of bias to tap into the unconscious thoughts and feelings people have and study this phenomena with adults, they noticed that their implicit racial bias predicted behaviors like how friendly they were to outgroup members, who they would hire for jobs, how they would vote in government elections, and even the kinds of treatment recommendations that doctors would make was influenced by their level of racial bias towards the patient. This, of course, are the kinds of behaviors that we said were persisting in adulthood. This led researchers to start to then want to ask, well, where do these biases come from? Where does this form of implicit bias come from if clearly it matters for our behavior? When we turn to now looking at the development of implicit bias, I think there's two general intuitions that we have about how our implicit biases form. The conventional view is this stuff is learned gradually from a lifetime of experiences with others, or what we hear about from friends and family or on the media. And just generically, if we were to plot a view like these things are learned gradually over time, you'd come up with some kind of graph like this, right? That shows as the child gets older, there's some increase in change in their level of preference, right? There's just change over time. This kind of generic view contrasts with the view that our implicit bias forms early in life and maybe even automatically, like an inevitable consequence of how our mind operates. There's classic research in social psychology that says that we have this natural tendency just to like whoever's in our group, even when those groups are arbitrarily created. And there's research showing that we just like things that are familiar to us. This kind of view would predict that implicit bias should form early, and there should be very little change across development. Now, as scientists, we want the data that actually adjudicates between these claims. And I'm going to walk you through how we marshal that evidence to weigh on these two competing hypotheses about the development of implicit bias. We made use of a measure called the implicit association test, and it's essentially a computer-based reaction time measure that looks at how strongly we compare concepts together. And I'll show you a version of what we did with young children. We would sit them in front of a keyboard and we'd tell them they'd see two groups of people presented one at a time in the middle of the screen. And if a face appeared in the middle of the screen that looked like the person on the blue side, they press the blue button. And if the face in the middle of the screen looks like the person on the yellow side, they press the yellow button. And here we're just getting them some familiarity with sorting faces by different races. Here I use cartoons. In the actual study, we use pictures of real people. All right, so you get the sense of what the exercise is like. Then the next part of the task, they're told they're going to hear words that are either good or bad through a set of headphones. And we do this just because their reading level is so variable. We want to sort of normalize it. So then they'll hear words, this. All right, get the idea. Okay, so then what happens next is we just pair it all together. And effectively what we're looking at is how quickly and accurately can they respond on trials like this when black faces and good words share the same response button and white faces and bad words share the same response button. And we compare those set of trials to a set of trials where those pairings are reversed. And the logic goes, if you have a stronger association with black and good, then you'll be faster, more accurate to respond on trials when they're paired together, because you can sort of tell yourself, good things go to this side and bad things go to that side. That's the logic of the methodology we use. And across all the studies I'll present, there's no gender differences observed, so I collapse across gender, and the data reported the same way, which basically means I'll spend a little bit more time explaining the graph to you on the first set of data, and then we'll quickly go through all the subsequent studies together. So Just as a reminder of our developmental predictions, if we think this learned gradual view is accurate, you're going to expect to see developmental change in the strength of their implicit race bias. And if you think that the early and automatic view is accurate, you'd expect to see stability in the magnitude of that implicit race bias across development, right? It would be there early and shouldn't change much thereafter. So now let's look at some of the data. In the first study we'll talk about, these are European American children. And on the vertical axis, we have the strength of the implicit association. And basically, the higher the bar, the stronger the association that white is good and black is bad, okay? When we measure adults, we see some level of implicit preference for white over black. This replicates past studies. This in and of itself isn't all that interesting. Really what matters for our sake is what happens developmentally. When you measure this with 10-year-olds, you see not only do they have implicit bias in favor of their own group, but it's no different than that with adults, suggesting that these biases are forming earlier than age 10. The question is what happens with 6-year-olds? When you look at 6-year-olds, you see the exact same result. By age 6, these are children in kindergarten, first grade. They have implicit bias in favor of their own group at levels indistinguishable from 10-year-olds and adults. Think for a moment about a 6-year-old. So again, kids in kindergarten to first grade, think about the wealth of experiences that would separate a 6-year-old from someone your age. And when we think about this intuition that these things might be learned gradually, we think our life of experiences and exposure to the views of others are what contribute to our unconscious bias. Yet what we're saying with these data is that already by age 6, they've formed this implicit bias at a level that's indistinguishable from adults. If you ask these same individuals to report explicitly, who do you like more, where they verbally respond, a higher bar means they show a preference for white over black, you see the classic explicit finding that by age 6, there's a strong preference for white, by age 10, it's there, but it's weaker, and by adulthood, it's gone. So explicitly, you see this decline, but implicitly, you see no change across development with the same population. Again, underscoring that they're really two different things, implicit bias and explicit bias. In the next study, we looked at African-American children and adults. When you measure adults' implicit preference for black relative to white, you see that there's no implicit preference for the own group. Here, this has been interpreted as a conflict generally between a desire to implicitly want to like your own group, but also internalizing the cultural standing of one's own group. And the assumption being that they might cancel each other out. In the Q&A, I can talk more about this because I think it's more nuanced than that. But a question here is, what do you see with 5 to 12-year-olds? It turns out we see the exact same pattern with 5 to 12-year-olds. And we've looked at every age in between, and there's no difference, so we group them together. And what this argues again for is that whatever the adult pattern is, by age 5 or 6, children have already internalized that same level of bias. We then conducted a study with a population of Latino Americans living in a predominantly Latino environment. And we gave them 2 different IATs, one where they contrast their own group, Latino, with a culturally higher status group, white, and one where they contrast their own group, Latino, with another culturally stigmatized group, black in this case. When we look at adults, when the comparison group is a culturally higher status group, white, you see no implicit preference. NS means not significantly different from chance. No implicit preference for the own group. This is really similar to what we saw with the African-American adults, right? But when we contrast the own group with another culturally stigmatized group, you see a clear preference for Latino, the own group, over this other group, showing that it's not like if you're in a culturally stigmatized group, there isn't implicit preference for your own group. It's just that it's sensitive to the cultural standing of who that comparison group is. When we look at 5 to 12-year-olds, we see the exact same pattern. Again, underscoring this notion that whatever the adult pattern is, already by age 5 or 6, kids are showing the same level of bias. Where this leads us is that it tells us that our implicit attitudes are quick to emerge and they're slow to change, right? By 5 or 6, we're seeing that they're evident already, and they don't seem to change in magnitude across development. This seems to really fit with the early and automatic view, right? Where you see the stability over age. Now, given everything I've just said, I want to be careful in that it's important to understand that just because there's stability in magnitude doesn't mean that there's no developmental change or capacity for developmental change. We know that adult implicit attitudes are malleable to an extent, that there's some evidence that you can change implicit bias with adults. But what we need is direct evidence of whether there are developmental differences in our capacity to change bias. So if you sort of think of bias as something like plaque on your teeth, and what we're saying is kids have plaque on their teeth and adults have plaque on their teeth. One thing we know about plaque is that it hardens over time. And the longer it sits, the more difficult it is to remove. And what we hopefully want are some studies across development that look at how easy is it to remove this plaque? How easy is it to undo the racial bias that's there? And is it easier to do this earlier in development versus later in development? So in the next series of studies, we tested a group of 7 10-year-olds, and they were randomly assigned to 3 different conditions. One where we introduced them to positive Black exemplars, one where we introduced them to positive white exemplars, and the control condition where we just tried to help them to feel good. And so we told them some nice stories about flowers. In each condition, there's 4 different vignettes that they were exposed to. And then we would measure their implicit race bias for white and Black. And the population of children in this were identified as white and Asian. I'll just give you an example of what a vignette might look like. If you're in the Black condition, you would have seen the photo on the left, or if you're in the white exemplar condition, you would have seen the photo on the right, and you would have had a corresponding story that was paired with it. And here we talk about this person, Karen, who helps to make sure children stay healthy, and just sort of some nice information about this person. And again, there'd be 4 such vignettes like this. In our control condition, we would have exposure to like a flower, and they'd learn some nice things about flowers. We're not going to read through the text right now. Here's what the data show. Again, a higher bar means you have an implicit preference for white and good. And with 7-year-olds, there's no effective condition. I'm not going to, in this talk, make a lot of sense of the different magnitudes of the 3 bars, but there's no effective condition here. But with 10-year-olds, there's a clear effective condition. Specifically, when they were exposed to the positive Black exemplars, what you saw was there's no longer an implicit preference for white over Black. It's now at the 0 point on the scale, which means implicitly you like both groups the same. And this suggests that this may be a critical period in development where we can start to undo that implicit race bias that's there. In a further study that now involved adults, we looked at their implicit race bias after an hour after they were exposed to those kinds of vignettes, where they'd learn about positive exemplars that were counter-stereotypical with respect to the sort of cultural stereotype of being Black. And what we are interested in is the difference between whether you're exposed to this sort of stereotypical information or that counter-stereotypical information, and whether after an hour delay, there's a point in development where that bias stays suppressed, meaning you have a weaker implicit bias. With adults, there's no effective time, meaning after an hour, after hearing those stories, basically whether you saw those positive Black exemplars or not, you now still show the same level of bias that other people show. But with older children that were roughly 10 years of age in this particular study, you still see this suppression in race bias, such that an hour after delay, that benefit of exposure to counter-stereotypical exemplars is still having an effect in that they have a weaker implicit race bias. Younger kids, there's no effect an hour later, suggesting that 10 years of age or this older age group in childhood might be especially important time to try to change these biases. So where this leaves us, again, is that implicit attitudes are quick to emerge and slow to change. that malleability might be easier in later childhood. But I think another key takeaway for this is that given that we show very clear evidence of implicit race bias already by 5 to 6 years of age, it becomes readily apparent that the roots of implicit bias begin much earlier in development. And so in the final study that I'm going to walk you through, we're going to look at this question of how early does implicit bias form? And we're going to look specifically in infancy and children who are about 1 year of age. And the goal of this study is to try to independently measure their positive and negative intergroup evaluations. So the IAT kind of gives you a relative read on whether one group is good and the other group is bad. With our measure that we developed, an infant version of the IAT, we can get a separate read on do they think one group is good, separate from whether they think the other group is bad. And I know you don't have a lot of background, maybe methods for studying infant cognition, and so I'm happy to answer in the Q&A a little bit more details about how this works, but I'll try to give you a sense of this quite quickly. So again, we're going to ask, do they positively evaluate familiar social groups, and do infants negatively evaluate unfamiliar social groups? In this particular study, we don't look at race, and I'm happy to answer why later. What we do look at is a social category that within the first few months of life, we know infants care a lot about, and that is people who speak their native language versus people who speak an unfamiliar language. And the way the paradigm works is we do something called measuring habituation, which is a way of just statistically saying the baby has formed an association and they're bored. When we habituate, it means we've essentially been bored by something. And so the more you see something repeated over and over and over again, you get tired of it and look away. And babies respond the same way as adults do. And so the logic of the method is, if we were to pair evaluatively congruent things together, things that babies think are nice, then they'll get bored faster than if we paired evaluatively incongruent things together. One thing they think is nice, one thing they think is bad. So what we do is we introduce babies to a puppet who's speaking in their native language. These are English exposed babies on a computer screen. And then once the puppet's done speaking, we measure how long the baby looks. And then we show them an image of something we know they like, such as fruit, for a period of time. And then we just show alternating trials of different puppets speaking in English with images of fruit that we know they like. And we measure how quickly they get bored by how soon it is before they start to look away. We do this with images they like. We do it with images they don't like in a separate group of trials. This would be the incongruent pairing now if English was paired with spiders. And we do this with a ton of different kinds of objects that they like, smiley faces and other things that they don't like. And we do this separately for English speakers, the familiar language, and French speakers, which is an unfamiliar language for these babies. Again, the logic is you should be faster to habituate when it's congruent pairs evaluatively. So if babies hold that familiar things are good, they'll habituate faster. They'll be slower if the familiar language is paired with bad stimuli like spiders. And relatedly, if they think the unfamiliar language, French speakers, are bad, they'll be faster to habituate when those objects are paired together, and slower to habituate when the unfamiliar is paired with good. So what we'll show here in this last graph, there's 4 different conditions, right? When the familiar language English is paired with the positive stimuli, when the unfamiliar language French is paired with positive stimuli, and then when those 2 languages are paired with the negative stimuli. And the mean number of habituation trials is what's plotted on the vertical axis. So English, they habituate some number of trials. The critical point of interest is that it takes them significantly longer to habituate when French is paired with those same good images, meaning they had an easier time pairing the English language with positive images, essentially showing that they have this evaluative association that what's familiar is good. We don't see any difference when we measure their habituation when it's a language paired with negative stimuli, meaning it's not that they have an association that the unfamiliar is bad. Right? So they do think implicitly by 1 year of age, what's familiar is good, but they don't think that what's unfamiliar is bad at this age. So returning to this question of, are we born racist, right? I think what this research clearly shows is that implicit bias emerges in infancy. It's driven by a preference for the familiar and high status groups, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A. But that outgroup negativity, that dislike, that anger, that hatred towards outgroups is something that takes longer to learn for children. And that childhood, in particular, later childhood, might represent a real critical time period to try to change the implicit bias that we have, in that it's notoriously difficult to change it with adults, but it seems that we have much greater success in later childhood to do so. And so returning to this, even though I think that we tend to see the world in terms of we and they, I think it even gets more nuanced in this, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A. Miguel de Cervantes has said there are only two families in the world, the haves and the have-nots. And I do think our psychology divides up the world in terms of us and them, those like me and those not like me, and those who are high status and those who aren't. But I think there is a lot that we can critically do to really change the content of our implicit bias and its influence on behavior. And so with that, I'd like to say I hope you guys enjoy this talk, both implicitly and explicitly, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions now. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew. Much to think with there. Jane, do you want to, I see a couple of, Brand has a question, for instance, but please use your hand function too and help Jane see you. Yes, hands for clapping above all also.
Should we go to student questions first?
That would be great.
Okay, Helena, you have a question. Do you want to elaborate on your question?
Oh, hi. Thanks, Jan. 1 second. Yeah, it's a very interesting seminar and talk. Thank you so much. Yeah, so this question actually comes from my personal experience. I have a 7-year-old, and lately he's been having a lot of discussion on race and color and things like that. So the reason this question came in is also we were recently watching a documentary on India's freedom struggle, and just to give a background, my son came to Canada when he was like 2. He doesn't speak any of the Indian languages. He's a brown kid, that's all in appearance, but he thinks like a Canadian mostly. So while watching the documentary, he just burst into this crying, like he was crying suddenly, and it was like strange for us. And he said like, how can these people do this to my people? And this is so wrong. Colonialists are so wrong. And I struggled for a minute to explain to him the concept of colonialist, because predominantly all of them were from the West, and some of his best friends are white background or white race. So there was a lot of tension in explaining to him that, how do I put it? Like, he's growing up in Canada. I don't want him to hate ancestors of his friends or like have an antagonistic feeling towards his friends. But on the other hand, I want him to understand about all these biases and things that he might face in his life. So yeah, in regard to your work and your research, I'm curious to understand that the children in the study, where they're exposed to other culture frequently, like on a day-to-day basis, like at school or I don't know, all these things, or were they growing up in a very homogeneous society?
Yeah. Great question. There's obviously a lot that's packed into that. At least with respect to the demographics of the children, it really varies from study to study. So the very first study with the European Americans, that was a predominantly white school where those children attended. The study with African American children was more racially mixed, but still, I think at that school they were in a majority. The Latino Americans was in a predominantly homogenous environment for Latino Americans. And that was strategic in terms of how we targeted that particular school to work with, because we wanted an analog to the European American study that we had. A lot of the malleability studies, children coming from much more diverse environments. And I will say that I think the research out there with exposure to diversity at a young age does weaken the strength of the bias, but it doesn't make it go away. And one thing I'll try to do is share my screen again. And bear with me. I'm going to flip to some other data I have that will help with addressing this question. That will speak to, I think, just the capacity that there's something about the way we form implicit bias that is almost in some ways inescapable for us. And so there's a number of studies that we published where we essentially took a group of children and we randomly assigned them to wear a red shirt or a blue shirt and handed them a t-shirt to actually wear that was that color. And then immediately gave them a child, these aren't kids in the study, and then we give them a child IAT where they're now sorting pictures of kids wearing blue shirts or pictures of kids wearing red shirts. And what we see in the actual data is that immediately after getting this random colored shirt to wear, kids now show an implicit preference for people who wear the same color shirt as them. And I think what that data is really telling us is that that this tendency just to want to identify with a group, whatever you think that group is to identify with, will generate some level of implicit bias towards that group. And so I think even when I think about data where there's more exposure to other groups, that children still have some level of bias. It just tends to be a bit dampened. And I think where there's interesting differences is how much negative, like I think the in-group liking and the out-group dislike are differentially affected by exposure. I think the out-group dislike gets sort of attenuated. I don't think that in-group liking necessarily goes away the more you have exposure to people of different backgrounds. So I do think it gets more nuanced, and obviously it's going to matter what the parents, are reinforcing at home as well, but for sure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Next question comes from Brianne.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for your talk. You touched on it a little bit there, but I was just wondering, in your studies, did you do a demographic analysis of your participants? Did you see differences between the kids or the adults from different backgrounds?
Yeah, great question. So we have tried to look at that, especially what I'd say is the malleability studies we benefited from having really large sample sizes because a lot of that research is taking place at Science World, where I have a lab here. And there's a lot of kids who come through there. We didn't see background effects there. I will say that we have done some research in other cultures. So we have a study that we did in Japan, and it was in a rural community in Japan, and we replicated the same basic effects. And I can, if there's interest, I could walk through this data. But the only other thing that I can think about is there's some studies that we did in a predominantly Black community on the East Coast, outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And there we found, again, it's different a bit from your question, but what we found was some relationships, and we looked at children who were attending predominantly Black schools, all the way from grade school to historically Black colleges, and those attending more racially diverse environments. What we found that really mattered was how much parents spoke to their children to prepare them for racism in the world, that would predict levels of bias. But by and large, I'd say the question has been understudied in terms of demographic differences that would help us get a better sense of why some children show certain levels of bias and not other kids. I think that's something we just don't have a clear enough answer on, and we need to do more work to figure out.
And do you mean implicit bias there or explicit
All
in that answer?
Yeah, implicit. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Hila has a question. I think this question is really hitting at the core of behavior. If you asked whether high implicit bias score associated, is high implicit score associated with real world racist behaviors?
Yeah, well, I think with adults, it's really clear that implicit bias predicts all kinds of behaviors. What we don't have a good grasp on, because the work just hasn't been done yet, is the predictive value of implicit bias in childhood, because children don't have the same power that adults do, that they can differentially wield to benefit others and to harm others. And so the forms of behavior that you can look at in childhood become substantially reduced and it's highly regulated. In schools, you can't get away with a lot, you know, and on playgrounds, you can't get away with a lot. And so we're kind of left with lab-based, you know, studies of, you know, would you share your cookie with the picture of the person on the screen, which is not the best way to really study this stuff. So I think that while the evidence with adults is pretty clear about it influencing behavior, the kid data is not quite there yet. I sort of look at it as, you know, again, if we think about plaque building on your teeth and eventually you're going to get cavities, that we see evidence of the plaque there in childhood. And now the question is, how can we get rid of it before it has the ability to do the kind of damage that we know it's doing later in life?
So in adults, is it true that a high D score on IAT predicts racist behaviors?
Yeah, well, the developers of the IT, I think, are really careful about how much you want to say an individual score predicts their individual behavior versus at the aggregate, people who in general are scoring higher are doing this, because they're really wary of, and I say this with personal knowledge because one of them was my advisor in grad school who created this measure, really careful about want to make sure people don't use this as a tool to evaluate people for positions or to punish people, you know, in criminal, you know, like legal context. And so we'll go as far as saying that at the population level, bias scores predict behavior, but careful not to say an individual who scores 0.4 will engage in this much more discriminatory behavior than someone who scores 0.3. I don't think the data doesn't support that. And I think there's a lot of reasons why people are cautious about trying to go that far with the type of method.
Okay. Galen, sorry, your hand just lowered. You still have a question?
Yeah, Erin kind of answered it a little bit. I just wondered if you could speak maybe just a little bit to some of the criticism about the IAT, its test retest reliability, and its sort of you know, adaptation as a psychometric measure, which has been used to, you know, say a whole host of things. And I just wonder if you could speak to how much you've maybe engaged with that and what you sort of think about the IAT as a measure, given that it says pretty powerful things about society.
Yeah. So what I'll say is the criticism of the IIT began day one. This goes back to the early 2000s. And a lot of the stuff that came back up, you know, over the last couple of years when a meta-analysis was published are the same kinds of arguments that kind of got hashed out in the academic literature in the early 2000s about like the reliability of it, the validity of it. I think the big thing that came out of a paper a few years ago had to do with with a meta-analysis that showed that when you change implicit bias, it can show reduction in race bias. It doesn't lead to a corresponding change in behavior. And that really puzzled people, and it got a lot of popular, I think, attention because it seemed intuitive at some level for some that, well, if the bias is now 0 or next to 0, why is there still, you know, discrimination, right? Or there's, you know, these behaviors. And there's two, I think, misunderstandings of that claim. First, the same was true actually for explicit measures, in that anytime you change a cognition, it doesn't lead explicit or implicit. Regardless of the measure, it's not leading to an immediate change in behavior. And I kind of liken it to something like weight loss. So let's say you engage in a New Year's resolution to live a healthier lifestyle, and you know you're consuming less and you're exercising more, and so you're burning more calories. But it takes a while before you actually start to feel that difference in your actual, you know, the way your clothes fit, or, you know, how you might psychologically feel about one's body. And I sort of look at it with implicit bias. What our measures often are doing, the way we study malleability, is that we're essentially drawing attention away from one aspect of the association and highlighting another part of the association that we hope to build up, like positivity with the group. And that unless we reinforce that, people kind of just go back to the status quo, like a regression to the mean. And that if you want to produce behavior, it's not a limitation of the IT method, it's a reflection of our interventions, that they're so brief. And that if you want to change underlying associations, you need to engage in repeated behaviors. So I think the critique is more about the approach to changing behavior and the relationship between, our approach to changing cognition, and not a critique of the IT in of itself, because I think it's method agnostic the limitations to how we approach trying to change implicit bias. I think there's a secondary sort of critique of the IT that has to do with what is it measuring? Is it measuring your personal bias, or is it measuring your understanding of what culture might think and say, what society says, or about a particular social group? That was the earliest critiques that emerged of the IT in the early 2000s, and I think was came up again in the last few years. And I think what is going on there, well, for starters, at some level, if we know it affects behavior, I don't know if I care personally, if it's like something you endorse, or if it's just the fact that you're being influenced by what society thinks. But also, given that young kids show it, I don't think it can be just that that a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old are so attuned to what society thinks about groups when they struggle to even label what the social categories are in society. I think it's something very different than this. And I think the developmental data suggests that these really are biases that an individual holds and aren't just reflections of their awareness of what the cultural status or what the cultural attitudes are about the status of groups. And I think that another question is, I think that has come up with critique of the IT is it how often in society are we pitting two groups against one another and thinking about groups in this dichotomous fashion? And versus when we approach individuals, it's just we're dealing with an individual and not with this person juxtaposed in another category the way structurally it is within IT. There are other kinds of implicit measures that avoid, I think, that methodological artifact that replicate the basic findings with using IAT as a methodology. And so, again, I think that there's more value added with the IT, even though it does introduce some noise. There's newer ways now with statistically controlling for that, or even methodologically tweaking the IAT. So you use something called like the single category IAT, where you're just measuring associations with one focal group at a time. There's other types of implicit measures that also just converge very nicely with the IAT that aren't subject to the same kinds of criticisms that rely on priming and other techniques. So I think that there are a lot of different critiques to the IAT. I think some of them are statistical and methodological that got hashed out in the early 2000s. Some are more conceptual about the malleability of bias and its relationship to behavior. And I just think it's much more nuanced than I think it's made out in the mainstream, but also it applies just as much to our explicit measures. And so I don't think it's particular to IAT, but as a general issue, the whole field has to probably think more about.
Great. Thanks, Eddie. The next up is Hadi. He has, I think, 3 questions for you.
Actually, I mean, the basic question is, at what age do children understand good and bad, or infants?
Yeah.
In the experiment, you had spiders are bad and fruit are
Yeah.
good, while my kids learned that spiders are good at a very early age. So I'm just wondering, at what stage are infants picking up the idea of other from parents? And then how does that change your idea of implicit?
Interesting. Yeah. So there's a lot there. So a couple things I'll say. On this notion of good and bad first, we chose the objects we did because there's other research showing that in infancy, these are things that they approach or avoid or like, or, and on other measures show evidence of liking or not. We also do this not just with those displays, but we have a set of some experiments where they see an English person doing something pro-social, like helping, or an English person doing something antisocial, like hurting or stealing. And we find that they habituate faster to the English speaker, the familiar language, person doing something pro-social. And we already know that by 3 months of age, they can discriminate pro-social and antisocial actions. And so I think that further reinforces that there's something really evaluatively, good or bad here that we're measuring. Now, in terms of picking up the otherness and what does that do for our notion of implicit bias? I think it's probably independent of our notion of implicit bias. I think that certainly this tendency just to recognize things as familiar, we know is there within the first moments of life. We have this preference for what's familiar for every sense modality, that even some of it beginning in utero even. And I think that the sense of like me and not like me, that might emerge later than just that's a familiar face or people. So by a few months of age, infants will show a preference for the face gender of their primary caregiver. I don't think they're internalizing it as like me or different from me. I think it's just starting out as this is familiar. And if it's familiar, yeah.
It's like me.
Yeah.
Like, you know.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think it'll become an interesting question once they start getting that sense of self. And certainly at this age, I wouldn't argue anything is explicit with babies. So I sort of assume that it's implicit. And then for me, an interesting question is when does the implicit and the explicit, start to diverge and does our implicit feed into our initial explicit beliefs? We just don't know where they're coming from, but it's being shaped by those early implicit, experiences. But it becomes increasingly harder to study kids, outside of a year of age. But that's what we need to figure out is ways to do it. We just don't have the methods and sometimes even the patience to study a kid, between 1 and 2.5 on these kinds of questions. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Layla, you're next.
Okay, I wasn't necessarily going to ask anything in particular, but I was just thinking of a question that I will ask. So apart from these sort of short-term experimental designs where you maybe look an hour after, I'm just thinking of your example in terms of the positive role model and the effects that you see there in terms of that. So could you think of any studies that are looking at these more in the longer durée sense by looking at exposure to stories where there are Black heroes and heroines and, some of those, whether it's about gender or race or other things, where those longer term exposures to different role models and or cultural icons, Dora the Explorer, whatever, how those make sense in a way that might be more meaningful than an experimental design that's more short term and contrived.
Yeah, excellent. So I'll say 2 things. One, in defense of our 1 hour delay, we got really creative. We had families that we gave them restaurant style pagers at Science World and would buzz them an hour later to come back. And that was a real novelty in the field to do for a lab-based study. But for longer term stuff, I'll tell you some things that we're doing. So this is in partnership with Science World, and part of this engendering success in STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math consortium that Jane mentioned, a part of, that's spearheaded by Tony Schmader in our psychology department, but comprises folks from all over Canada in industry and in academia. And the focus is how do we create a more inclusive environment for women in STEM from childhood all the way through the pipeline down to women working for engineering firms professionally. And what we're doing on the childhood side of it is we're working with Science World that has several science enrichment programs that span 9 weeks as an after-school program. And what we've been partnering with them to do is to measure how children's implicit gender stereotypes about STEM is impacted by participation in this program, and how the facilitators might play a role, like the gender composition of the facilitators might play a role in changing children's implicit gender stereotypes. So that's a 9-week program. Science World has another program that's suspended right now, but it has to do with bringing scientists from the community into Science World so visitors can have a chance to meet them. And we have studies planned but are on hold because of COVID, where we'd be working and tracking children who regularly engage with female scientists in particular through this program to look at what the long-term effects are over weeks and months on their implicit gender stereotypes. So those are a couple of things that we're doing that have a much longer span. There is some research that's been done by Kang Lee, who's at the University of Toronto, where they do have interventions to look at race bias, and over many months, the training has it's very low level. It's actually, it's not about the content of our associations, but just helping people to learn to discriminate perceptually faces of another race, and looking at how that might translate into our ability to individuate people more and to think less of them as in a stereotypic way. And there's some effects there, although really tiny samples. I sort of take it with a grain of salt. So there's some work that's out there, and a lot of our work is just looking at this in the case of gender bias implicitly.
Thank you.
Great. Terry.
Thanks, and thanks for a great talk. You packed a lot in a ruthlessly short time. Just following up on a little bit on Hadi's question, it seems really hard to tease out how much of this is a function, again, of that classificatory system that loads on familiarity and these enormous external factors. I mean, your opening question, are we wired this way? Are we born this way? Yeah. Versus, an overwhelming context that favors certain directions. Any suggestions for digging into that? Because it seems an impossible set of things to control, and psychologists think about individual and cognitive behavior. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to think about when we're trying to understand. So first, this question, are we born racist? What I would say is that no, we're not specifically born racist. I think what we are born with is a capacity to categorize. We know this before I was even born, that we have this capacity to categorize. We have this tendency to like things that are familiar. And I sort of think about our social group biases as something like the way I think about language, that we humans are wired to learn a language, but the specific language we learn is entirely culturally dependent, right? And so, when my son was born, he could have been put anywhere in the world and would have picked up whatever that language was that he was exposed to. And the way I think about social group biases is that our minds are wired to categorize. I think they're wired to, obviously, to like what's familiar. And they are, I believe, wired to really want to think about the social world. And they're motivated to figure out what's socially relevant to my existence. I think that's a uniquely human thing. Or I think there's maybe one other species maybe that goes along with this, but I think that but then our experiences, our environment, and factors in the environment, like whether you're growing up in an environment where there's a lot of intergroup conflict. We see different patterns of intergroup bias in Israel, for example, where there's more intergroup conflict, right, with neighboring countries than you might in like a North American suburb. And so I think that there's contextual factors that might exacerbate or sort of, add fuel to this that will kick it in sooner. So you're more readily paying attention to different social categories. I think what varies culturally is which categories we care about. So in India, right, caste can be a meaningful dimension of social classification that a child growing up in Vancouver who isn't exposed to that sort of cultural context might never think about social groups in that way. But I think the underlying tendency to think about social categories and the motivation to want to identify which categories are relevant for my life, I think that's a universal. But when we think about certain categories and how we think about them, I think is really culturally determined. There's a lot of factors in terms of your exposure, the broader cultural context that's going to make a difference to shaping the nature of those biases, especially as it relates to outgroup negativity.
Thanks very much.
Okay, one last question, hopefully a quick one from Naveen.
Hi, Andrew. So I'll keep it quick. One of the most interesting results in your study was the malleability in later childhood. And I was thinking about, in terms of interventions, it seems like intervening, the roots are really hard to deal with. People growing up in different communities, different cultures, different parents. But it seems like a positive thing to discover that there's more malleability in later childhood. And I'm wondering if you would agree with that.
Well, it's certainly positive, certainly very positive. And I think that, it's so hard to change it with adults. We actually struggled and had to do a lot more heavy-handed lifting with adults in our studies to get their biases to change. Whereas with the 10-year-old, that just came really much more easily. It's also an age when kids are starting to appreciate a little bit more on average that social categories, can be social constructions and all these other kinds of explanatory variables. I wouldn't rule out yet that there's not hope with younger kids. We do have some work in the lab showing that with a little bit more nudging, we can get their biases to change. And so, I do think that in later childhood, children are able to entertain different perspectives a little bit better than in earlier childhood. They have better skills with executive functioning and sort of inhibiting, their initial responses. But I do think that there will be useful techniques that will want to start the job earlier. And if anything, that might just make our life easier once we start getting to the older ages to work with. But I do think it's possible to still work with younger kids and changing bias. I just think it takes a little bit more effort than it does with the older kids. And I think that the older kid work certainly, we've cracked a nugget there. I think we really need to mine that fully, to understand, best strategies for changing bias, and critically getting into one of the earlier questions, figuring out which strategies actually produce those long-lasting effects and changes to behavior that matter at the end of the day. Like, if it's just about change in the lab, it's not gonna, matter much, right? Like, we really need to make sure that this is something that we can follow up way down the road and see that it's having an effect. And obviously, interventions aren't going to be like that. They need to be sustained and reinforced. And especially when there's so much in the culture that often goes against those efforts, right? That we're going to need to figure out what strategies and how to reinforce them that's going to yield the outcomes that we're hoping for.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, let's thank Andy again. And that concludes our seminar today. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Andy. That was terrific.
Thanks, Andy.